December 18th, 1972, and the city of Hanoi prepares for what will become the most intensive bombing campaign of the entire Vietnam War as President Richard Nixon orders the unleashing of American strategic air power against the capital of North Vietnam in an operation officially designated Linebacker II, but known to history as the Christmas bombing. After 4 years of gradual American troop withdrawals under the policy of Vietnamization, and after months of frustrating negotiations in Paris that seemed close to producing a peace agreement before North Vietnamese negotiators suddenly introduce new demands and walk away from the table, Nixon makes the decision to demonstrate American resolve and capability through overwhelming application of air power against targets that have been protected from attack for most of the war. The strategic situation in December 1972 is complex and delicate because Nixon has been elected on promises to end American involvement in Vietnam while achieving peace with honor, and he desperately needs a negotiated settlement before his second inauguration in January that will allow him to claim success while bringing American prisoners of war home and withdrawing remaining American forces. The North Vietnamese negotiators understand Nixon's political vulnerability and believe they can extract better terms simply by stalling and introducing new demands, calculating that American domestic pressure will eventually force Nixon to accept whatever terms they offer, rather than continue the war indefinitely. Nixon's response to this calculation will be to demonstrate that he is willing to escalate the war dramatically and to strike targets in Hanoi itself with the full weight of Strategic Air Command's bomber fleet, betting that the threat of unlimited bombing will convince North Vietnamese leadership to return to serious negotiations. Operation Linebacker II will employ B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers against targets in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas for 11 days with a pause for Christmas, and these massive 8-engine jets designed originally to deliver nuclear weapons against Soviet cities will instead drop conventional bombs on specific military and industrial targets in the most heavily defended airspace in the world, where over 1,000 surface-to-air missiles and thousands of anti-aircraft guns create defensive network far more formidable than anything American air power has faced since World War II. The campaign will cost 15 B-52 bombers shot down along with 11 other aircraft and 93 American airmen killed or captured, but it will also accomplish its objective by forcing North Vietnamese negotiators to return to Paris and sign the peace agreement that Nixon needs. The strategic bombers, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, represents the ultimate expression of American strategic air power, a massive aircraft with wingspan of 185 feet and maximum takeoff weight of over 220,000 kilograms, powered by 8 turbofan engines that give it intercontinental range and ability to carry up to 27,000 kilograms of conventional bombs in internal bomb bays and on external wing pylons. These aircraft were designed during the early Cold War to penetrate Soviet air defenses and deliver nuclear weapons against Russian cities in the event of World War III, and they represent technology and capability that no other nation possesses at comparable scale or sophistication. Strategic Air Command operates the B-52 force with crews trained to the higher standards of precision and reliability, because the mission of nuclear deterrence requires absolute confidence that these aircraft can penetrate any defense and deliver their weapons accurately, regardless of opposition or conditions, and this culture of excellence and perfectionism extends to conventional bombing missions, even though the stakes are theoretically lower when the weapons are high explosive rather than nuclear. The aircrews who will fly Linebacker II missions are among the most experienced and skilled aviators in the world, many with thousands of hours in the B-52 and previous combat experience in Southeast Asia, and they understand both the capabilities and limitations of their aircraft when operating in heavily defended airspace. The B-52 has been employed throughout the Vietnam War for arc-light missions that drop bombs on targets in South Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia from altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the aircraft remain essentially invulnerable to ground fire. But these missions have been conducted against targets with minimal air defenses and have never required penetrating airspace protected by modern surface-to-air missiles and radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery. Linebacker II will require B-52s to fly directly over Hanoi and Haiphong at altitudes where SA-2 surface-to-air missiles can engage them effectively, and this represents fundamentally different and far more dangerous employment of these aircraft than anything they have done previously in this war. The SA-2 guideline missile manufactured by the Soviet Union represents the most capable surface-to-air weapons system deployed anywhere in the world during 1972, and the North Vietnamese have received hundreds of these missiles, along with sophisticated radar systems and trained operators from their Soviet allies who have made air defense of Hanoi a priority second only to defending Moscow itself. The SA-2 can engage targets at altitudes up to 80,000 feet and at ranges exceeding 30 kilometers, and while the missile has limitations including poor performance against low-altitude targets and vulnerability to electronic countermeasures, it remains extremely dangerous to aircraft operating in its engagement envelope, and the B-52, flying at 30,000 to 40,000 feet over Hanoi, will be operating exactly where the SA-2 performs best. The plan and the targets. The targeting for Linebacker II focuses on military and industrial facilities that directly support North Vietnam's war effort, including rail yards and storage depots and power plants, and communications facilities and airfields and petroleum storage areas, with specific emphasis on targets located in and around Hanoi and Haiphong that have been off-limits for most of the war due to political restrictions designed to avoid civilian casualties and to prevent potentially escalatory confrontation with Soviet or Chinese forces. Nixon's decision to authorize strikes against these previously restricted targets represents dramatic escalation that is intended to shock North Vietnamese leadership into recognizing that continued obstruction of peace negotiations will result in unlimited bombing of their capital and industrial infrastructure. The operational plan calls for waves of B-52s to strike designated targets over multiple nights, with supporting operations by tactical aircraft that will suppress air defences and strike additional targets, while F-4 Phantom fighters provide protection against North Vietnamese MiG interceptors and electronic warfare aircraft jam enemy radar systems. The campaign is planned to last 11 days with maximum effort on the first 3 nights to deliver shock effect before settling into sustained operations that will continue until North Vietnamese negotiators agree to return to Paris and resume serious negotiations, and planners estimate that approximately 200 sorties by B-52 bombers will be required along with hundreds of supporting tactical aircraft missions. The first night will target storage and supply facilities on the outskirts of Hanoi, along with the Yen Vien rail yards that serve as major transportation hub for military supplies moving south from China, and subsequent nights will strike additional rail facilities and the Bac Mai airfield and fuel storage areas and other targets selected to maximize military impact while theoretically minimizing civilian casualties. The selection of targets reflects both military necessity and political sensitivity, because Nixon and his advisors understand that international reaction to the bombing campaign will depend significantly on perceptions of whether the strikes are legitimately targeting military objectives or are simply attempting to terrorize the civilian population of Hanoi into submission. The first night, December 18th, at approximately 1900 hours on December 18th, the first wave of B-52 bombers lifts off from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam and from Utapao Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand, beginning the long flight to their assigned targets in the Hanoi area, with each 3-aircraft cell climbing to cruising altitude while navigating toward the coast of Vietnam, where they will rendezvous with supporting aircraft before continuing to their targets. The crews are tense because they know this mission is different from the Arc-Light strikes. They have flown previously against undefended targets, and they understand that flying over Hanoi through concentrated surface-to-air missile defences represents the most dangerous mission that B-52s have attempted since the aircraft entered service nearly 2 decades earlier. The North Vietnamese air defence network detects the approaching bomber stream while the aircraft are still over the Gulf of Tonkin, and alert sirens begin wailing throughout Hanoi as the population scrambles for bomb shelters while SA-2 missile batteries are brought to full alert and crews prepare to engage the American aircraft. The North Vietnamese have been preparing for this possibility throughout the war and have created one of the most sophisticated and dense air defense networks in history, with overlapping radar coverage and multiple missile batteries positioned to engage aircraft from any direction, and the operators manning these systems are experienced and well-trained through years of defending against American airstrikes. The B-52s approach their initial points and begin their bomb runs flying in 3 aircraft cells, with relatively tight spacing that allows them to concentrate their defensive electronic countermeasures while maintaining formation discipline. But this tight formation also means that if North Vietnamese missile operators can get a successful firing solution on one aircraft, they may be able to engage multiple targets from the same cell. The lead cells reach their release points and drop their bombs on assigned targets below, while defensive systems operators watch their scopes for indications of missile launches, and almost immediately the distinctive radar signatures of SA-2 missiles appear as the North Vietnamese begin launching salvos at the bomber formations. The missile engagements develop rapidly as SA-2s climb toward the bomber formations with pilots and electronic warfare officers watching the approaching threats, while attempting to defeat them through combination of electronic jamming and defensive maneuvers. But the sheer number of missiles being fired overwhelms some of the defensive systems, and several B-52s are hit by missiles that detonate near the aircraft, causing catastrophic damage. The first loss occurs when an SA-2 explodes close enough to a bomber that shrapnel penetrates vital systems and the aircraft begins losing control while the pilot fights desperately to maintain altitude. But the damage is too severe, and the order comes to abandon the aircraft while the 6 crew members eject into the night sky over North Vietnam. By the end of the first night, 3 B-52 bombers have been shot down with 18 crew members, either killed in the shootdowns or captured after ejecting over North Vietnam. And while this loss rate of approximately 3% might seem acceptable in statistical terms, it represents a shocking blow to Strategic Air Command's confidence in the survivability of their premier weapon system, because these aircraft were supposed to be able to penetrate any defense through combination of altitude and speed and electronic countermeasures, yet the North Vietnamese defenses have proven more capable than anticipated. The targets are struck successfully, and significant damage is inflicted on rail yards and storage facilities. But the cost in aircraft and crews raises immediate questions about whether this campaign can be sustained at these loss rates for the planned 11 days. The tactics fail. The second and third nights of Linebacker II on December 19th and 20th see continuation of strikes against targets in the Hanoi area, with modifications to tactics intended to reduce losses after the first night's casualties, but the fundamental approach remains unchanged, with B-52s flying in tight formations at predictable altitudes along relatively straight and level bomb runs that allow North Vietnamese missile operators to track them effectively and set up successful engagements. The crews are growing increasingly concerned because the tactics being employed seem to favour the defenders by making the bombers predictable and easy to track, and multiple crews report that the SA-2 missiles appear to be waiting for them along the planned routes, as if the North Vietnamese have advanced knowledge of the attack profiles. On the night of December 20th, 6 additional B-52s are shot down in the most catastrophic single night of the campaign, with 36 crew members either killed or captured, and the loss rate climbing to levels that cannot be sustained without depleting the entire bomber force available in the theatre. The crews are furious because they can see that the tactics being mandated by Strategic Air Command headquarters are getting them killed while achieving results that could likely be obtained with different approaches, and several aircraft commanders file formal protests arguing that the rigid formations and predictable routing are creating a situation where they are essentially flying into prepared ambushes night after night. The problem is complex because Strategic Air Command has trained for decades on the assumption that tight bomber formations with massed electronic countermeasures represent the best defense against surface-to-air missiles, and this doctrine is deeply embedded in planning and procedures that are difficult to change rapidly in the middle of combat operations. But the reality over Hanoi demonstrates that the North Vietnamese have learned to defeat these formations through sheer volume of missiles and sophisticated engagement tactics that exploit the predictability of American routing and timing, and the longer the campaign continues with unchanged tactics, the more effective the defenses become as the North Vietnamese defenders learn and adapt, while the American bombers continue flying essentially the same mission profiles night after night. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Conley flies as an electronic warfare officer on one of the B-52s participating in these strikes and watches with growing alarm as his defensive systems show multiple SA-2 missiles being launched at his aircraft and the other bombers in his cell, and he works desperately to jam the missile guidance radars while the pilot executes limited defensive maneuvers that are all the massive bomber can manage at high altitude. And as SA-2 explodes close enough that the aircraft shudders from the blast and warning lights illuminate throughout the cockpit, indicating damage to multiple systems. But somehow the bomber remains flyable, and they are able to complete their bomb run and return to base with significant battle damage that will require extensive repairs. The Christmas pause. On December 23rd, the bombing campaign pauses for a 36-hour Christmas ceasefire that has been announced publicly to demonstrate American goodwill and to provide opportunity for North Vietnamese leadership to reconsider their negotiating position. But the pause also provides critically needed opportunity for Strategic Air Command to fundamentally rethink the tactics that have resulted in unacceptable losses during the first 5 nights of operations. Senior commanders gather at Andersen Air Force Base and Utapao to review what has gone wrong and to develop new approaches that will reduce vulnerability while maintaining strike effectiveness. And the crews who have been flying these missions are consulted directly about what changes are needed. The consensus that emerges from these discussions is that the tight formations and predictable routing and rigid adherence to planned flight paths must be abandoned in favour of more flexible tactics that reduce predictability while still allowing bombers to reach and strike their assigned targets effectively. The new tactics will include varying altitudes and approach directions and release points, while loosening formation spacing to reduce vulnerability to single missile shots destroying multiple aircraft, and post-target turns will be executed more aggressively, even though this stresses the aircraft, because getting out of the target area quickly proves more important than maintaining smooth flight profiles. The Christmas pause also allows maintenance crews to work around the clock, repairing battle-damaged aircraft and preparing the entire available bomber force for the resumption of strikes on December 26th, and the aircrews use the brief respite to rest and recover from the stress and exhaustion of flying combat missions over the most heavily defended target in the world, while watching their fellow crewmen being shot down night after night. The psychological toll has been severe, because the tight-knit bomber community means that everyone knows the crews who have been lost, and everyone understands that any of them could be next if the tactics do not improve. The tactics change. When operations resume on December 26th, the revised tactics are immediately apparent as the bomber formations approach Hanoi from different directions and at varying altitudes, with spacing between cells increased significantly to reduce the chance that multiple aircraft can be engaged by single missile batteries, and the post-target turns are executed more aggressively with aircraft dispersing rapidly after bomb release rather than maintaining formation discipline through the turns. The North Vietnamese missile operators find themselves unable to achieve the same firing solutions that had been successful during the first 5 nights, because the bombers are no longer appearing where expected, and the formations no longer present the concentrated targets that allowed single salvos to threaten multiple aircraft. The results are dramatic as losses drop significantly despite continued heavy missile activity, with the North Vietnamese firing hundreds of SA-2s during these later strikes, but achieving far fewer successful intercepts because the changed tactics make tracking and engagement much more difficult. 2 additional B-52s are lost on December 26th and 27th, but the rate is far lower than the catastrophic losses of December 20th, and crews report that while the missions remain extremely dangerous, the improved tactics give them better chance of surviving while still accomplishing their objectives. Captain John Mize flies as radar navigator on one of the later missions and watches his scope intently as his aircraft approaches the target, while SA-2 missiles appear on the defensive systems displays indicating multiple launches tracking toward their cell. But the spacing changes mean that his aircraft is not flying in close formation with others, and the pilot is able to execute more aggressive defensive maneuvering that throws off the missile tracking while still allowing them to reach their release point. They drop their bombs successfully on the assigned rail yard target and execute hard post-target turn that banks the massive bomber steeply while accelerating away from the target area, and while they can see missile detonations in the sky around them, none achieve close enough proximity to cause damage, and they return safely to base, having survived what remains one of the most dangerous missions in aviation history. The Linebacker continues. The final nights of Linebacker II from December 28th and 29th see maximum effort, strikes against remaining targets on the priority list with particular emphasis on rail facilities and storage areas that North Vietnam requires to support military operations in the south. And these strikes benefit from the tactical improvements that have been implemented, along with the fact that North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile inventory is being depleted after firing over 1,000 missiles during the campaign, with resupply from the Soviet Union uncertain given the international attention focused on the bombing. The North Vietnamese continue defending with determination, but their capability is degraded by missile shortages and by cumulative losses among trained operators who have been killed or wounded during the campaign. By December 29th, when the final strikes are conducted, the North Vietnamese air defense network is significantly weakened but still dangerous, and the last B-52 loss of the campaign occurs on this final night when a bomber is hit by an SA-2 and crashes with loss of the entire 6-man crew. This brings the total losses for the 11-day campaign to 15 B-52s, along with 11 other aircraft, including F-4 fighters and support aircraft, with 93 American airmen killed or captured, and these losses representing the highest casualties suffered in any concentrated air campaign since World War II. The material damage inflicted on North Vietnamese military and industrial infrastructure is extensive, with rail yards destroyed or severely damaged, and storage facilities burned and power generation capacity reduced, and fuel storage areas demolished, and communications facilities disrupted. And North Vietnamese officials later acknowledged that the campaign caused significant problems for their war effort and forced them to reconsider their negotiating strategy, because continuation of this level of bombing would have resulted in complete destruction of their ability to support military operations in the south. The combination of military damage and political pressure, and the demonstrated American willingness to escalate dramatically, convinces North Vietnamese leadership to return to Paris and engage in serious negotiations rather than continuing the stalling tactics that had prompted Nixon to order the bombing campaign. The return to Paris, on December 30th, just one day after the final Linebacker II, strikes North Vietnamese negotiators contact American representatives in Paris and indicate willingness to resume negotiations without the preconditions and new demands that had caused the breakdown in October. And this represents exactly the outcome that Nixon sought when he ordered the campaign, because he needs a negotiated settlement quickly to fulfill his campaign promises and to bring the prisoners of war home before domestic political pressure makes continuation of American involvement in Vietnam completely untenable. The negotiations resume on January 8, 1973, and proceed rapidly toward conclusion, with the peace agreement being signed on January 27th, just 1 month after the end of the bombing campaign. The Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973 provide for ceasefire and withdrawal of remaining American forces from Vietnam and return of American prisoners of war, while allowing North Vietnamese forces to remain in positions they occupy in South Vietnam. And while the agreement is presented as peace with honor, it essentially represents acknowledgement that the United States is abandoning South Vietnam to its fate, while extracting itself from involvement in a war that has become politically unsustainable at home. The provisions of the agreement are almost identical to what had been negotiated before the breakdown in October that prompted Linebacker II, leading to questions about whether the bombing campaign achieved anything beyond convincing North Vietnamese leaders to sign an agreement they were already willing to accept before the escalation. Nixon and his advisors claim that Linebacker II forced concessions from North Vietnam and demonstrated American credibility and resolve in ways that made the final agreement more favorable than it would have been without the bombing, but critics argue that the same agreement could have been achieved in October without the additional 11 days of bombing and without the loss of 93 American lives and 15 B-52 bombers. The debate about whether Linebacker II was necessary or effective continues among historians and military analysts, with defenders pointing to the fact that negotiations resumed immediately after the bombing ended, while critics note that the final agreement gave North Vietnam essentially everything they wanted while allowing them to claim they had withstood the most intensive American bombing campaign of the war. The prisoners return. The most tangible and emotionally powerful result of the Paris Peace Accords is the return of American prisoners of war who have been held by North Vietnam in various prison camps, with the most famous being the Hanoi Hilton, where prisoners endured years of torture and deprivation and isolation, under conditions that violated every standard of the Geneva Conventions. Operation Homecoming begins in February 1973, as North Vietnam releases approximately 600 American POWs who are flown first to Clark Air Base in the Philippines for medical evaluation and debriefing, before continuing to the United States for reunions with families who have waited years for this moment. Among the returning prisoners are many of the aircrews shot down during Linebacker II, who spent only weeks in captivity rather than the years endured by earlier shootdowns, but even brief captivity in North Vietnamese hands proved brutal, as the new prisoners were interrogated and pressured to make propaganda statements condemning the bombing campaign. Several Linebacker II prisoners, including B-52 crew members, described being paraded through streets of Hanoi, where angry crowds threatened violence while their captors filmed the scenes for propaganda purposes, and all report harsh treatment designed to break their will and extract statements useful for North Vietnamese propaganda, even though the short duration of their captivity limited the psychological damage compared to those who'd been held for years. The return of the POWs provides powerful emotional closure for American involvement in Vietnam because these men represent the sacrifices made during the Long War, and their return allows families to be reunited and allows the nation to feel that something positive has been salvaged from the failed effort. The POW return also validates Nixon's claim that Linebacker II was necessary to force North Vietnam to negotiate seriously, because without the bombing campaign, it remains uncertain whether North Vietnam would have released the prisoners or would have continued holding them as leverage for future negotiations. The controversy and criticism. The bombing campaign generates immediate and intense international criticism, focused primarily on civilian casualties, resulting from strikes in densely populated Hanoi area, with North Vietnamese officials claiming thousands of civilian deaths and widespread destruction of residential areas, while American officials insist that only military targets were struck and that civilian casualties were minimal and unintentional. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes, because while American targeting did focus on legitimate military objectives, the reality of dropping thousands of tons of bombs on targets in and around a city of 1 million people inevitably results in some civilian casualties from bombs that miss their aim points or from secondary effects of explosions at industrial facilities. International press coverage includes dramatic imagery of destroyed buildings in Hanoi and accounts from foreign journalists describing civilian suffering and casualties that create impression of indiscriminate bombing, even though military analysis suggests that the campaign was conducted with significant restraint given the capabilities available and the political stakes involved. The Soviet Union and China issue strong condemnations of the bombing as war crimes and terror tactics, while European allies express concern about the escalation and question whether the campaign serves any legitimate military or political purpose, and anti-war movements in the United States and around the world organize protests characterizing Linebacker II as final criminal act in an already immoral war. Religious leaders, including the Pope, condemn the Christmas bombing as particularly offensive given the timing during a season associated with peace and goodwill, and this criticism resonates with many Americans who question whether bombing a city during Christmas represents the kind of moral leadership that the United States should demonstrate. Nixon responds to critics by arguing that the North Vietnamese left him no choice after they walked away from negotiations that were nearly complete, and that demonstrating American resolve through forceful action was necessary to achieve peace, but the controversy contributes to already severe erosion of support for his administration's Vietnam policies. The military assessment. From a purely military perspective, Operation Linebacker II demonstrates both the enormous capability and the significant limitations of strategic bombing when employed against determined adversary with modern air defenses, and the campaign provides valuable lessons that influence American air power doctrine and tactics for decades afterward. The ability of B-52 bombers to deliver massive tonnage of conventional ordnance with reasonable accuracy against targets deep in enemy territory remains unmatched by any other nation and represents decisive American technological advantage. But the loss of 15 B-52s and other aircraft proves that even the most sophisticated bombers remain vulnerable when operating in heavily defended airspace, and that tactical innovation is essential to survival. The effectiveness of North Vietnamese air defenses employing Soviet SA-2 missiles and integrated radar networks demonstrates that surface-to-air missiles have fundamentally changed the calculus of strategic bombing by denying attackers the sanctuary of high altitude that previously provided protection from ground-based weapons, and the reality that defenders who are willing to expend large numbers of missiles and accept significant casualties among their operators can exact heavy toll on attacking aircraft forces' recognition that future conflicts will require either suppression of air defenses before bomber employment or acceptance of potentially prohibitive losses. The tactical changes implemented during Linebacker II, including increased spacing between formations and varying approach routes, and more aggressive post-target maneuvering prove essential to reducing losses, and these lessons are incorporated into Strategic Air Command doctrine that shapes bomber operations through the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. The experience of flying combat missions over Hanoi under intense missile fire provides B-52 crews with hard-earned knowledge about defensive tactics and electronic warfare employment that cannot be replicated in training, and veterans of Linebacker II become highly valued instructors who pass these lessons to subsequent generations of bomber crews. The strategic success. Despite the controversy and the losses, Linebacker II achieves its primary objective of forcing North Vietnamese negotiators to return to Paris and complete the peace agreement that allows Nixon to claim he has achieved peace with honor while extracting the United States from Vietnam. And this strategic success validates the decision to employ maximum air power, even though questions remain about whether the same result could have been achieved through other means. The fact that serious negotiations resume within days of the bombing ending suggests that North Vietnamese leadership was indeed influenced by the demonstration of American capability and willingness to escalate, though whether they were actually forced to make concessions or simply decided that signing an agreement they already found acceptable was preferable to enduring further bombing remains debatable. The campaign demonstrates to allies and adversaries around the world that the United States retains both the capability and, under certain circumstances, the will to employ devastating military force in support of its objectives, and this demonstration of resolve has value beyond the immediate tactical results because it signals that American withdrawal from Vietnam should not be interpreted as general loss of capability or willingness to use force when national interests are threatened. For Nixon personally, the campaign provides the success he desperately needs to justify his Vietnam policies and to claim that his approach of negotiation backed by force has produced better outcome than simply abandoning South Vietnam without attempting to secure favourable settlement. The final withdrawal. The peace agreement signed in January 1973 allows for a 60-day period, during which remaining American forces withdraw from Vietnam and American prisoners of war are released, and by March 29, 1973, the last American combat troops depart from Vietnam, ending direct American military involvement that has lasted nearly 2 decades if measured from the earliest advisory efforts in the 1950s. The withdrawal occurs under terms that leave South Vietnam vulnerable to eventual North Vietnamese conquest because the agreement permits North Vietnamese forces to remain in the south while prohibiting American military intervention to support the Saigon government. But this outcome is acceptable to Nixon and to American public that has grown weary of the war and wants withdrawal regardless of the consequences for South Vietnam. Within 2 years of the American departure, North Vietnam launches final conventional offensive against South Vietnam that succeeds completely when South Vietnamese resistance collapses far more rapidly than anyone anticipated, and on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crash through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, marking the final defeat and the end of South Vietnam as an independent nation. This ultimate outcome raises fundamental questions about what Linebacker II actually accomplished, because while it forced North Vietnam to sign an agreement in January 1973, that agreement did nothing to prevent the eventual conquest that the bombing was theoretically intended to forestall. The legacy of Linebacker. Operation Linebacker II remains one of the most controversial military operations in American history, because it combined maximum application of high-technology military power with questionable strategic objectives and significant civilian suffering while achieving diplomatic results that could arguably have been obtained without the bombing, and different analysts reach different conclusions about whether the campaign represents success or failure, depending on which criteria they emphasize. For those who focus on the immediate outcome of forcing North Vietnam to negotiate and releasing American POWs, Linebacker II was a necessary and successful operation that achieved important objectives through decisive use of military force. But for those who note that the peace agreement merely delayed inevitable North Vietnamese victory by 2 years, while costing 93 American lives, the campaign appears as futile final gesture in a war that was already lost. The 11 days of intensive bombing from December 18 through December 29, 1972, with Christmas pause in the middle, remain vivid in memory of all participants because of the intensity and danger of the operations and because of the dramatic losses suffered particularly during the early nights before tactics changed. And the veterans of Linebacker II carry with them knowledge that they participated in the most concentrated application of American strategic air power in a generation, and that their missions directly influenced the negotiated end to American involvement in Vietnam. For the 93 Americans who died during the campaign, and for the crews who were captured and endured weeks or months in North Vietnamese prisons, the costs were immediate and personal, regardless of debates about strategic success. For historians and military analysts, Linebacker II provides case study in the uses and limitations of air power as instrument of policy, demonstrating that bombing can force negotiation but cannot necessarily determine the content of agreements, and that air power employed without complementary ground forces capable of securing gains can achieve only temporary results that evaporate once the bombing stops. The campaign also demonstrates the importance of tactical flexibility and the dangers of rigid adherence to doctrine when facing adaptive enemies, and these lessons influence development of American air power capabilities and operational concepts through subsequent decades. December 18 through December 29, 1972, when Strategic Air Command's B-52 bombers struck Hanoi and Haiphong in the most intensive bombing campaign since World War II, losing 15 aircraft and 93 airmen, while forcing North Vietnam to sign peace agreement that brought American prisoners home and allowed withdrawal of American forces while leaving South Vietnam to face its fate alone. Operation Linebacker II, the Christmas bombing that ended American involvement in Vietnam while settling nothing about Vietnam's future. The 11 days that demonstrated both the power and the limits of American military capability, the final act in a long war that ended not with victory or defeat but with negotiated withdrawal that satisfied no one except those who simply wanted the war to end regardless of outcome.